Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium of the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. If you are interested in tracing your family history but don't know where to start, join us for a virtual beginning genealogy workshop at 10 a.m. on Saturday, August 28th. MDAH Director of Library Services Allie Mellon will walk participants through the public resources available at MDAH and how to use them. You can register for this free event on the department website. Then tune in next week for the live stream of History is Lunch, when Susie Altman will present Saving a Folk Art Icon, Margaret's Grocery. Today, we are delighted to welcome back our friends Carolyn Brown and Ellen Ruffin to discuss their new book about the de Grummond Children's Literature Collection at the University of Southern Mississippi. Carolyn J. Brown is a writer, editor, and independent scholar. She is author of The Artist's Sketch, a biography of painter Kate Freeman Clark, and the award-winning biographies A Daring Life, a biography of Eudora Welty, and Song of My Life, a biography of Margaret Walker. And I believe you did History's Lunches for all three of those. Ellen Hunter Ruffin is Associate Professor at the University of Southern Mississippi and has been Curator of the de Grummond Children's Literature Collection since 2006. Ruffin has served on the Newbery Medal Committee, the Children's Literature Legacy Award Committee, and the Schneider Family Book Award Committee, among others. We'll hear first from Ellen Ruffin.
Thanks. We are certainly happy to be here and happy to see a few friends in the audience. Chuck Gailey, who I will see next week as he brings some more papers to the collection. I want to just begin with explaining a few things about the book itself. And the number one thing is the cover. There are three of us involved in this book, Carolyn Brown, Eric Tribunella, and me, and we had figured what kinds of things we could use for the cover, but Carolyn actually remembered a holiday card that Paul Zielinski, a little-known Caldecott Award-winning artist, had drawn for the de Grummond Collection one holiday season. And she said, you know, that was the most striking card, and so she asked me if we still had it, and we did. So that is actually what comprises the cover of the book, and you can see it's every area of children's literature, all kinds of things. And I'll tell you a little secret. This is his doodle. So, you know, we can all only hope to doodle in such fashion. And then the next thing was the title of the book, a de Grummond Primer. Many of you are aware of the idea of a primer, and interestingly, of course, children's literature, children's reading started with learning to read in church or children learning to read the Bible. In America, certainly it happened with the Puritans in Sunday school, in the home school environment. But it was called, you know, a prayer book at that time was called a prayer book, and it was used often to teach children. And as things evolved, it became known as a primer. And because children are learning to read with a primer, we thought it was appropriate to talk about the collection. And this is a primer, an explanation, a beginning of the de Grummond Children's Literature Collection. And I wanted to show you, oh dear, the next picture. This is the pictorial primer. It's just sort of the frontispiece of the book itself, and it's by Grandfather Leary, Really, it is a pictorial primer for children created by Lawrence Lovechild and published in 1846. Letters of the alphabet corresponding with pictures. A is an archer, not A is an apple. We've come a little ways since this book. B is a blacksmith. It really does sort of date when the book was published. 1846. Carolyn, as you know, had written several books about Mississippi women. And, of course, Eudora, Margaret Walker, and also Kate Freeman Clark. And she called me and said, Ellen, I want to find another Mississippi woman to write about. And I thought, no, not me. No, I'm joking. That is truly a joke. So I said, you know what? Come to de Grummond, let's look and see what we have. If indeed there's enough material for you to write a book about Lena. And I'm not going to infringe on her talk because she'll tell you the Lena story. But simultaneously, a professor at the university, actually an associate dean English professor, Eric Tribunella, who's also a children's literature scholar, and I had been wondering how we could approach a de Grummond book, what we would do. So while Carolyn was there, I called Eric, asked him to walk over to the collection, and we met, and the three of us decided we could work together and how it would work. And Carolyn would take care of Lena de Grummond, the founder of the collection, and we would invite various children's literature scholars to write short chapters about the unique facets of the collection. So, and we all were involved in selecting images for the book, and we're very proud of the outcome. It's a lovely book about the collection. So it's Carolyn's turn. Carolyn?
Hello, everyone. As Ellen just told you, I was responsible, let's see if I can use this, for the first chapter on Lena. And I quickly realized in doing my research about Lena de Grummond that founding the de Grummond Collection was a second act for her. After a first career as a librarian in Louisiana, working her way up from being a desk librarian to working for the Louisiana State Library Commission, and finally being named State Supervisor of School Libraries for the last 16 years of her career. She only stopped working because she had to. Mandatory retirement at age 65. But for Lena de Grummond, as the quote states, it was not an ending, but a beginning. She was invited in 1965 to teach children's literature at the University of Southern Mississippi. And that first children's literature class that she taught met once a week at night for 4 hours. It was primarily adult students who were working and would drive upwards to 100 miles each way to attend class. And because she recognized the commitment that these students were making to come to class each week, she said, this is a quote from an essay she wrote about the collection, "Such students are surely worthy of all the enrichment a teacher can give." And her first career as a librarian helped her here. She knew a lot of authors and illustrators and decided to write to them and ask if they had anything of interest that they could send her that she could share with her students. She facetiously said, "If you put your materials in the trash basket, please mail the basket to us." A few months later, that first casual letter was transformed into the more formal letter that you see on the screen, written on university letterhead, and it actually included the word collection. And de Grummond not only sent it to authors and illustrators she knew, but to all. No name was too big or too important not to contact. And this more formal letter moved a lot of authors and illustrators to give. And not only give, but initiate a dialogue between de Grummond and some of the most famous children's authors and illustrators of the 20th century. And what I want to do right now is read you the letter. I've highlighted what I think is the most important paragraph, but it's a short letter, so let me read it to you now. It's hard to see it on the screen. Since my recent retirement as state supervisor of school libraries of Louisiana, I've come to Mississippi to teach library science at USM. I'm trying to build an outstanding collection of children's books, grades 1 through 12, to serve the librarians and teachers, and through them, the children, all children of Mississippi. We are ordering copies of your books, but we lack those materials which enrich a collection: manuscripts, illustrations, dummies, scripts, proofs, sketches, rough notes, etc. Would you please help us with some of yours? We want to set up a collection of your materials in your name. And in parentheses, such gifts are tax deductible, you know. Well, in fact, a lot of them did not know. And that was one of the arguments that spoke to them, as was the paragraph I've highlighted here, that it would get to the children, all children of Mississippi. So, the beginning of this official letter writing campaign began in 1966, and the response to it was simply incredible. She writes in that essay I referenced earlier that she typically wrote 100 letters per week, sometimes up to 400 to 500 per week. And I want you to think about that because she did not have a computer. Her first positive reply to this letter came from the Hayders, Berta and Elmer Hayder, in January of '66, authors and illustrators of The Big Snow and Ding Dong Bell. And wouldn't you love to get a letter like this? The letter itself is a treasure. And they responded, "We would be very happy to send you a manuscript and some illustrations from one of our books." And that letter was followed just 4 months later in April '66 from the Rays, the authors, illustrators of Curious George. And wouldn't you love to get this? This letter, of course, is also like the Hayder letter, decorated in the signature style of the authors and illustrators, with Curious George making his way to Hattiesburg. And I highlight this quote, not because it's that important, but I just love the tone. It's a shame on the postmaster in New York who first returned your letter to you as undeliverable. He did have my new address. And that's what these letters are so fabulous. I mean, I couldn't have written any of my books without having access to letters. And this was the beginning of a correspondence with de Grummond and the Rays, which Ellen is going to tell you more about later. Well, not all writers de Grummond was contacting were as keen to send materials as the Hayders and Rays were. This author, H. Arthur Klein, raised concerns about sending his materials to Mississippi, as the news was not all that positive about the state in the mid-1960s. If you recall, we had the assassination of Medgar Evers, the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, and the refusal of de Grummond's own institution to admit a student of color. And this had some authors hesitate about giving their works over to USM. And I'll read you this paragraph because his letter represents a group of letters that I found in the collection. And he writes to de Grummond, "Your letter emphasizes the phrase, 'all children of Mississippi.' I could not in good conscience make presentations of material that has been so important in my working life if it were to be maintained in a collection inaccessible to teachers or pupils on the basis of skin pigmentation, religious preferences or backgrounds, or ethnic differences." Well, I don't have de Grummond's response to that letter, but I can tell you that she must have alleviated his concerns, because today there is an H. Arthur Klein collection in the de Grummond. And I make the case in the book that I think she really was serving as an ambassador for Mississippi with this quiet letter writing campaign. Sometimes, as I just showed you, the letters themselves are the treasures in the collection, not an actual book. And that's the case here with J.R.R. Tolkien, who, of course, we know as the author of the Lord of the Rings novels. De Grummond had written to Tolkien, and he wrote back 2 letters. And what you see in front of you is the second letter. The first letter, he tells her he has nothing to send, and then he forgets to sign it. And he must have realized quickly that he had forgotten to sign it, so he wrote a second letter. And he says, "I'm very sorry I did not sign my first letter to you. I write again to provide you with a signature, and also to say that, moved by your plea, I will look into the matter and try and find some item or items for you." Well, in fact, he never does, but we do have these 2 letters from him in the collection, one with the signature and both on his letterhead. So how did de Grummond keep up with all of this correspondence if she was in fact writing hundreds of letters per week? Well, she was a librarian first and foremost, and knew how to organize. And in the collection, I discovered a plethora of notebooks that all contain notes on the authors and illustrators she was in contact with. Each notebook represented a year or a partial year of time, and each page was dedicated to one writer. And of course, in library fashion, pages were alphabetized by last name within the notebooks. Each page is set up as you see before you, with name, address, list of works, and what they have given on the top. And then on the bottom, a paragraph with notes about a phone call, meeting, etc. And the example here is of Michael Bond, the creator of Paddington Bear. And what was funny was no one was exempt from this system. Even her own daughter, who she collaborated with on a couple of biographies, had a page in the notebook dedicated to her. All this hard work paid off, and de Grummond's collection expanded far beyond her original intent of just collecting show-and-tell items for her students. In 1968, 2 years after starting her official letter-writing campaign, de Grummond organized the first children's book festival at USM. Although I think de Grummond realized many would not actually attend, the invitation served as an excellent way to introduce the collection to a wider audience. Many did attend, though, and those that did gave both the festival, Hattiesburg, de Grummond herself, and the collection rave reviews. And I wanted to read you one of those letters from someone who attended the festival. The woman who attended was a writer named Margaret Oler Hill from Laramie, Wyoming. And this letter is in the collection. She writes, "Dr. de Grummond, just to note, to let you know what a stimulating experience the Hattiesburg Conference was, I came home and wrote an article right away and got to work on my book. I can't tell you how proud I am to be included in your author collections. Makes me resolve to be a more deserving author. I love Hattiesburg and its warm, friendly people. It was especially wonderful meeting you. I do think you're such a splendid person, and so does everyone I talk to about you. In short, I think you did a beautiful job with the conference, especially considering that this was its first year." So it's just, again, another statement for what de Grummond was doing in the 1960s, that I think she was serving as an ambassador of goodwill for our state. So de Grummond officially retired in 1970. I mean, I've only talked about a 5-year span here. But retirement, as I say in the book, was not a word in her vocabulary. She continued to write letters, recruit authors and illustrators for the now annual conference, and travel the world on behalf of the collection. To recognize her work, the University of Southern Mississippi honored her the year she retired by naming the collection after her. And thus the Lena de Grummond Collection was born. And now Ellen and I will tell you about some of the amazing treasures that you can find in our book and in the collection.
We'll try to rip through these. The first chapter, as you can see, let me just explain something. We have that first part that is about Lena, and then the other chapters are about very significant areas in the collection. And so we have a great friend named Ruth Boddigheimer, who is one of the foremost fabulous, fairy tale, and folk tale scholars in the world. And she has contributed books and her work to us. And so we felt very comfortable asking her to write the chapter on fables, fairy tales, and folk tales. And you'll see that the Tales of Fairies by oh, wait, I've got to get it right because I don't want to say it incorrectly, that we have in the de Grummond the first English edition of Dull Noise, Tales of the Fairies, printed by John Nicholson in London in 1707. So we go back early. 1530 is our earliest imprint. Then the next chapter is hornbooks, battledores, and chapbooks. I think this is probably familiar to this audience, but the hornbook was among the earliest literacy tools produced for children between 1400 and 1800. And it consisted of a single sheet of paper that contains an alphabet, perhaps a catechism. I mean, remember, they were learning to read to be able to go, if indeed something happened to their short lives, that they went to the right place upon death. It was all about religion at that point. And anyway, there would be lowercase letters, numerals, prayers, and the sheet of the text was either handwritten or printed after 1450, when movable type was, of course, brought into the existence of writers, and was laid on a paddle frame that could be anywhere between 4 and 9 inches tall. It's small. And when we call it a horn book, it's because the horn means the skin of a lamb or a ram's horn. Any kind of horn was used to laminate the horn book, and you'll see that it's tacked into place, and often there would be a hole at the tip of the handle. I don't think this one has that, for children to be able to put around their necks or keep safely, because it could be easy to lose. Then that was followed by a battledore. And this came about because printing was much easier. This was less expensive, less time-consuming, and actually you'll see illustrations. This must have been, this was one of the first attempts to use illustrations with learning. Sort of an obvious thing for us in this day and age, but it was a new concept at this period of time. Then the Oh, I didn't tell you who wrote this chapter. Laura Wazowitz, who you'll notice is a curator of children's literature at the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. A true scholar, and we were thrilled to have her addition to the book. This particular entry is very interesting. It's Readers and Primers. Paige Gray, who is a professor at Savannah College of Art and Design in Atlanta, and she says in her chapter, the American readers contained in the de Grummond Children's Literature Collection provide a fascinating and telling history of children, and more importantly, adults' ideas of children, the history of the child and childhood. And of course, maybe best known are Readers, McGuffey Readers, which were first printed in 1836. We have a full run of those. And also, in addition to the text as foundational as the McGuffey Readers, the de Grummond also preserves and protects educational tracts largely unknown, such as the Southern Primer, which I'll show you in a little while, and the Union Reader, as well as others, including my very first Little Spanish book, which was 1880, and the everlasting ABC and Primer, which you see here. And what I love, I'm not going to use the laser pointer, but if you'll look up at the top, you'll see that Faye Jones must have received this for Christmas in 1891. We never remove any of the marks in the books because that whole thing tells a story. It's fascinating to know. Anyway, one thing that I think is very interesting to point out, and again, the connection to country and religion, and look, we've got A is for apple, and then C is for church. So, of course, it goes along with the period of time and where society was at that point. Okay, Carolyn? She said, is it my turn already?
Do you have the...
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. I have the pleasure of telling you about the next 3 slides that go with a chapter on the golden age of illustrated children's books, which is the second half of the 19th century. And this chapter was written by Alexandra Valent, who's a professor at Southern Miss. And in the chapter, she highlights 3 artists that you may be familiar with: Walter Crane, Randolph Caldecott, and Kate Greenaway. And Valent provides a fascinating glimpse into the stories behind the art that I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. This slide is highlighting a Walter Crane illustration from a 1886 edition of Aesop's Fables. And Valent writes about Crane that he looked at a book as a unified whole and a single page as a space to be made beautiful in design. And this particular image, I think, serves as a wonderful example of that lavish style. And it's also interesting to note that this edition of Aesop's is unique because Crane utilized a Greek motif throughout it from beginning to end. And you can see some of those elements in the image here. The next image is Randolph Caldecott, and it comes from an 1878 edition of The House That Jack Built. And note how few words are on the 2-page spread. And Caldecott, compared to Crane, opted for less detail, and he famously told his biographer, quote, "The fewer the lines, the less error committed." But author Maurice Sendak credits Caldecott's economy of language with actually the invention of the picture book. And so, of course, you can see many more images in our book of his work, but it does, you can kind of get the sense here of he's starting to tell stories through images and that interplay of text and image. And finally, in that chapter, Kate Greenaway. And some of you might be familiar with Kate Greenaway's work. She was extremely popular at the end of the 19th century. And here is an image of an 1888 illustrated version of Robert Browning's 1842 poem, The Pied Piper of Hamelin. But what's unique is that this work is actually different from the typical Greenaway works that you might be familiar with, which are populated by flowers and gardens and happy children in charmingly, Val Lint writes, antiquated hats and dresses. But here the children, yes, they are joyful, but they're dressed in a more earthy palette, and they are more in a medieval kind of clothing and garb. And she's also, what's really interesting about this particular work and why it stands out amongst all the Greenaway materials that the de Grummond has, is that she strikes a different tone from the Browning poem. So Browning's poem, if you remember, the end of it ends on a somber note where the parents and the town feel this guilt and loss for the children leaving and following the piper. But look, the children actually look pretty happy, don't they? and she does that in all her images for this work. The children look as if they've been liberated more than they've been kidnapped. And so the original versus the Greenaway version are very different. And this work thus stands out amongst the collection. And the de Grummond is known for having a significant amount of Greenaway materials for scholars to come and look at. Letters, sketches, drawings, even her earliest greeting cards are in the collection. I also get to tell you about another great essay in the book about children's series fiction. And the image you have on the screen is of The Wizard of Oz. And a lot of people don't know or recall that it was the first of a series by L. Frank Baum, written between 1900 and 1920. This is a picture of the title page of a first edition. Amy Patty, who wrote the essay for this chapter, does a great job of giving us a history of children's series fiction from the earliest series in 1835, the Rollo series, and taking us through more modern works like Sweet Valley High and the American Girl series. I especially enjoyed this chapter because it reminded me of Eudora Welty, and she would write in her memoir and essays about reading things like The Campfire Girls and Elsie Dinsmore, both of which are mentioned in this chapter. I also get to tell you about the chapter our colleague Eric, who was not able to join us today, wrote for the book. He contributed this chapter on editions and variants. And one of the most important aspects of the de Grummond collection is the number of editions of a single work that it holds. So for instance, on this slide, all those books depicted there are a variety of editions of The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgins Burnett. So shelves of them. And it's an important area of scholarship as different editions reveal alterations of text that impact the meaning or reception of a work. And I wanted just to read you just a short excerpt from Eric's chapter where he explains that idea using Little Women as an example. So Little Women was originally published in 1868. But if you compare the 1868 edition with the 1880, there are these changes in language. So for instance, Beth's original statement that she, quote, can't practice good a bit becomes in 1880, can't practice well at all, making Beth seem more proper, talking about her piano. And Marmee goes from being stout and not particularly handsome in 1868 to being tall and noble looking in 1880. equating Marmee's moral stature with her physical attractiveness. So it really makes, it made me more aware reading this chapter. I learned so much from my own book, honestly. But depending on what edition you read, how that will read in your mind. All right, and then Ellen's going to come back up. Skip those two.
I can't let go is variance has taken on a different meaning today with the Delta variant. So this is one of the really significant pieces of the collection because periodicals disappear. They are used and tossed. Think about magazines that we have or journals. It's very hard to remember to save them. And so Lorinda Cahoon, an associate professor at University of Memphis, who also has a particular interest in children's periodicals, early children's periodicals, did this particular chapter. And the periodicals flourished in the 19th century publishing company, and de Grummond contains many examples of it, and one in particular, of course, this is the girls' own paper. We also have the boys' own paper. And, but what you will notice, and I can't read the date, is that 1894? Yeah. We also have a full run of St. Nicholas. And interestingly, that was founded in 1873, and Mapes Dodge was the original editor. She wrote a book titled Hans Brinker, which I remember because I may be of a certain age. But I wasn't alive when it was written. However, it was still very prominent and reading for children when I was growing up. But the other people who appear in these St. Nicholas magazine stories are Louisa May Alcott, Frances Hodgson Burnett, Mark Twain, Joel Chandler Harris, who did Brer Rabbit, E.B. White, Charlotte's Web, Nathaniel Hawthorne. You ever heard of him? And one other familiar name on the list is Eudora Welty. I suspect we know who she is. We also needed a chapter on dolls, toys, toy books, and games. Megan Norcia, who's a professor at SUNY College at Brookport in New York, is the one who contributed to this chapter. And I had to take this quote directly from her chapter. The study of children's material culture is a growing field, as we see toy books now. We see all of the things that go along that publishers package with them to delight children. But if we really think about it, John Newberry's A Little Pretty Pocketbook in 1744, he was the first to really recognize a commercial market, the potential for commercial success in children's books. But he did add a ball for boys and, I can't remember what he added for girls, but it wasn't as much fun as a ball, of course. And, but also this is a Stapp, Emily Blackmore Stapp, who was originally from Iowa and moved to Mississippi, lived in Wiggins, even at the time of her death in 1962, had written some children's books at about 1913, 1910, during World War I, called The Tribe of the Gohawks. And it was all about children who loved to play Indian. Certainly not a very popular nor politically correct perspective anymore, but it again fills in so much about how children were taught and what they were thinking. And this is one of the dolls. She had a group of children who would meet at a wigwam in Iowa. and they were members of the of the Gohawkappy tribe, and that's an example of the costumes they wore. They put them on the dolls. There's John Newberry, 1787, this particular edition. Now, picture book art, which will be a very familiar thing for Chuck Gailey, is really the process that came about, as Carolyn said, with Caldecott and with the other two, Kate Greenaway and Walter Crane, who were able to realize the connection of picture and words. And there's that interdependence between the text and the image. And of course, again, I mentioned Mari Sindak, who said words can be left out or the pictures can be there, but the story is told with both. So this is a particular picture by H.A. Ray, who created Curious George. And it tells the story of, the name of the book is Zebrology. It has no words, only art. And it details how zebras came to be. Not really, but a fun telling of how that happened, where an initial pairing of a black horse and a white horse, and the book is terrific. I recommend it thoroughly. Okay, Carolyn? There you go.
Okay. So I get to tell you about children's nonfiction. As a biographer, I think that's appropriate. And it's in a really extremely interesting chapter, including a discussion of early cookbooks, space travel, and even familiar titles such as this book, Benny the Bulldozer, you might remember. The chapter was written by two professors at Southern Miss, Jennifer Brannock and Andrew Haley, who make a really good case for the importance of nonfiction, a genre often wrongly slighted when compared to children's fiction. It just doesn't get the attention that fiction typically does. But this chapter talks about its importance and the history of it, this genre, to the field of children's literature. Benny the Bulldozer, for instance, was a groundbreaking, literally, when it was published in 1947, and it helped children make sense of the world during the building of the interstate highway system in the 1950s and urban renewal projects in the 1960s. So it's interesting to read about how these nonfiction titles really reflect their environment at the time. And we also have a chapter on African American children's literature and writers, which was written by Deborah Taylor, who's a widely recognized scholar in the field. Taylor writes how the history of, and I'm going to quote her here, African American books for young people has been an ongoing struggle to counter negative images and stereotypes about Black people that have been pervasive in the United States throughout the years. She highlights 5 books that buck that trend and all are represented in the de Grummond collection. One, which she mentions, is the one featured here, Popo and Fafina, written in 1932 by Arna Botham and Langston Hughes. And when it was first published, it was greeted with much excitement and approval, and the New York Times even praised it and suggested that all children's books should be written by poets. And this is how this book has taught me things. I mean, I teach Langston Hughes all the time, and I didn't know he was the author of a children's book. The other important aspect of this chapter is Taylor highlights the important librarians who did so much to promote books about and for African American children. Okay. You're up.
And sorry, I know we keep going back and forth. This particular chapter is about Southern children's literature by Laura Hackala, assistant professor at University of North Carolina, Pembroke. And during the antebellum era, children's literature from all regions had didactic intentions, but Southern works taught the virtues of slavery to white readers. And you'll notice here, the Southern Primer and the New England Primer. This one was published in 1865, I believe, and by Babcock. And you'll see it says Southern Primer, and it looks just like the New England Primer, and it's constructed very similarly. However, if you'll notice, it only has the Southern states, and you'll see some cotton picking, an image at the bottom there, and you'll notice that it was published in Charleston. It's a very interesting chapter and does bring it up to contemporary times, but it's an interesting history. Then, contemporary children's literature by Ramona Caponegro, associate professor at Eastern Michigan University, wrote about the papers that we have in the collection, Richard Peck, John Greene, and of course she discusses new realism that came about in the 60s, which contemporary writers have been able to explore an increasing array of topics, many of which were previously taboo. I don't know if you know about young adult and children's literature now and the new realism. Books for children deal with difficult topics and yet don't leave children hanging in agony. They bring it together and sort of offer them hope. I wanted to point out, this is Richard Peck, who's one of our favorite authors, wrote this book, The Teacher's Funeral, and it says, if your teacher has to die, August isn't a bad time of year for it. That's often thought of as one of the best opening lines for a book. So, and it really exemplifies Richard's humor. Do you recognize these books, Little Golden Books? The de Grummond has a full run and more of golden books. Anita Silvey, former editor of Horn Book Magazine and publisher of books at Houghton Mifflin, wrote this chapter for us, and I can't think of a better person to have done it. She gives the history of of golden books. They were after World War II, and racks of little golden books appeared in the grocery stores. Again, because I'm of a certain age, I remember going to the A&P with my parents and plopping down at the book rack while they went to the vegetables. Anyway, let me go on. Then we couldn't go without mentioning the H.A. and Margaret Ray collection. This is an image by H.A. Ray, who did Curious George. I need to stop and let you know that Curious George turned 80 yesterday. So we are celebrating his birthday this year, and we're going to have a walk, an 80-mile walk. Not in one day. It will begin on September 1st and end on November 12th. And you can go to the de Grummond website and find the little way to sign up for the walk. And we think it's one thing that won't be canceled because everybody needs to be outside with the virus doing what it's doing. But Hans Augusto and Margaret Ray never set out to write books for children. However, the opportunity came about when an editor noticed Hans's humorous drawings and had him create a children's newspaper and asked him, a children's book, asked him if he would base it on one of the characters in the newspaper and the publication of Raffi et les Neuf Singes, Raffi and the Nine Monkeys. So George was one of those monkeys, but his name was Fifi because he was first written about in Paris, and then they were there as the Nazi occupation was occurring. They couldn't get out, but Ray, H.A., procured bits and pieces of bicycles, and they rode bicycles out of Paris into the French countryside, caught a train, and then made it to Portugal, which was, of course, a neutral country. They were both citizens of Brazil, so they got to Brazil, and from Brazil, they landed in New York, and their publisher in England had moved to Houghton Mifflin as an immigrant as well. So they were really lucky. They landed well. And George was published in 1941. And I will let you know that he wasn't called George in England. He was called Zozo, because there was a king on the throne who had the name George, and there was not a good feeling about that. So Anne Malloy Ashmore, who is a retired associate professor at Delta State, was also at de Grummond when the Ray papers started coming in, and we couldn't think of a better scholar to have written this particular chapter. It is extraordinary. And the Ezra Jack Keats collection, I have to say, this was written by Rudine Sims Bishop, professor emerita at the Ohio State University. It's a beautifully written chapter, and that little boy right there, Peter, really sort of is historic. Let me put it that way. Keats won the Caldecott in 1962. It was the first Caldecott award-winning book to feature an African-American child as the protagonist. And interestingly, Peter grows. Keats kept Peter and used him in other books. It's a phenomenal, and I don't know if you can tell on this slide, but he used collage in ways that were expressive and phenomenal. Here are some other collections that we included in the book, and we're almost right out of time. But we have Tanahoban, which is that particular image at the top, by Allison Kaplan, who is at University of Wisconsin, and Sid Hoff papers. Sid Hoff was a cartoonist. He also wrote Danny and the Dinosaur. Do you guys remember his cartoons? Tasha Tudor. Did I say Tanahoban? That is Tasha Tudor. Tanahoban was a photographer and illustrated concept books with photography. Phenomenal. Richard Peck by Roger Sutton, and the James Marshall collection. Danielle Bishop Stuhlig wrote that particular chapter. Danielle was at the de Grummond for 20 years until she got married and moved, and now she's at LSU having a great time, but we still miss her. But we're just so pleased with the different contributions to the book. We couldn't have had better scholars. Is there anything else?
No,
I don't
think so. We're ready. We can
We've
take
taken you
questions.
through the book effectively.
Yeah.
Are there any questions?
We do have questions from the live feed. Our friend Dee Dee Baldwin from Mississippi State says, regarding the correspondence from authors who were concerned about racism and segregation, and de Grummond apparently reassuring at least one of them, do we have letters or other documents that show her working with African American kids before schools were integrated?
Not that I found, no.
I don't know of
Have you ever
any,
seen
to be honest.
No.
And then we had a question about, de Grummond was an author,
Yeah.
Yeah.
sort of a YA general,
Biographer.
yeah. Could y'all say a few words about that?
Those books, I wish I had brought one.
Yeah.
Because they're biographies I read as a child.
Yeah.
The little orange biographies that had conversation in them as if they knew what Ben Franklin said when he was 10 years old.
Creating the dialogue, yeah, yeah.
But de Grummond did write 4 of those.
4, and with her daughter as a collaborator as well.
Jeb Stewart,
Babe
B.B.
Diedrichson.
Baby
the golfer.
Diedrichson, and
couple. Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson?
No.
No. Jefferson Davis?
Jefferson Davis, which is an interesting choice.
Ties into Dee Dee's question
Yeah,
a
it
little
does.
uncomfortably.
Yeah, I have no idea why she chose the subjects that she did. But as a biographer, maybe she just wanted to delve deeper and,
And those were written before
yes.
she came to
Oh,
USM
Yeah,
and sort of speak to, yeah.
yeah.
We had a question about whether Ms. de Grummond had any relationship or knew Welty or Charlotte Capers or any of the other folks that were sort of tangentially.
Not that I'm aware of. I didn't see any correspondence. I mean, she retired in 1970.
Yeah.
She moved to Williamsburg and lived with her daughter. In her later life, she died in 1989. So
Yeah.
I don't. Do you know of anything?
No, I was trying to think. There are definite connections in the collection to Eudora Welty, and it comes from Emily Blackmore Stapp, who I told you about earlier, who had, she was in Wiggins, and she wrote to the Secretary of State to talk about the money she had raised. She raised over $45,000 in pennies. Children collected pennies for the orphans in Belgium and France in World War I. And then she was at Wiggins when she was doing war bonds. And interestingly, Wiggins and Mississippi and Iowa per capita were the largest buyers of war bonds in the United States, which I thought was kind of interesting. But she wanted the Secretary of State to know that she had done this. So she wrote, she didn't need Facebook. She wrote the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State wrote her and said, "Thank you so much. What great work you have done. I'm going to pass this on to Eudora Welty, our editor of the, Society pages of Jackson Daily News."
Yeah.
Is that right,
Is that
Forrest?
what she?
Well, it would have been, is this the 40s?
Yeah.
Yes.
It would have to have been early.
I don't know if she was the editor, but she wrote Society.
A columnist, yeah.
Society
Right.
column. So it's really fun to see the connections.
circle.
And there's a connection to Piney Woods as well with
Are-
Emily Black.
Are there Mississippi writers or artists represented in the
Oh.
de Grummond?
Yes.
We actually considered doing a chapter on that. We talked about it. I was keeping a list of ones that I was finding. I just don't think we really knew
Well,
who would write that chapter.
Actually, Sarah Campbell has some stuff in the collection that she doesn't even realize she has. But we have some of her from the wolf snail,
Yeah.
the backyard predator, which we treasure. And this man right here, Chuck Gailey, who's going to visit with me next week and bring some more, we have. But we also have Deborah Wiles, a National Book Award winning author, Margaret McMullen,
Yeah.
Augusta Scattergood.
Gusty Scattergood.
And it goes back. I mean, I found much older materials from Mississippi writers. Yeah.
We want the Mississippi authors. And right now, as I've said, is a great time to be a children's author if you're from Mississippi. We have some very talented people writing and publishing and involved in the work itself.
Can folks visit?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what we see when we come there?
Yeah, yes. If you would let me know you're coming, it's helpful. However, we'll drop anything. If someone wants to see something, we try to accommodate that. And right now, we are in the midst of this uncomfortable period of time with the virus, but if you wear a mask, that's your ticket. You can see anything, and we'll bring it out for you.
That's great. Well, the book is beautiful. It's a de Grummond Primer published by University Press of Mississippi. Copies of it available at better bookstores across the state. Thank you all for tuning in today. We will be virtual again only next week for Susie Altman when she talks about Margaret's Grocery outside Vicksburg. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Carolyn, for being with us. We look forward to working again with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.